Official history is a fragile construct written by victors and edited by bureaucrats. According to the archives of the Smithsonian, the mighty Saturn V rocket last roared into the heavens in December 1972. They tell the world that the Apollo program was canceled due to budget cuts and a lack of public interest. But if you talk to the retired engineers in the smoky bars of Merritt Island, men with shaking hands and eyes that have seen too much, they will tell you a different story. They will tell you about the gray flights.
By 1974, the United States was a country in turmoil. Nixon was falling. The Vietnam War was a bleeding wound, and the energy crisis had gripped the nation. Yet, in the deepest basements of the Pentagon, a group known only as the Oversight was funneling billions into a mission that didn't exist. They called it Apollo 18. Its destination wasn't the vast, sunlit plains of the Mare Tranquillitatis. No, they were going to the South Pole of the Moon, to the Shackleton Crater, a place where the shadows are 4 billion years old and the temperature hovers near absolute zero.
Commander Jack Sterling was a man built of granite and silence. A former test pilot who had survived 3 mid-air disintegrations, he was chosen because his heart rate never rose above 60, even when death was staring him in the face. Beside him stood Ben Lawson, a genius-level navigator with a penchant for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. They were told their mission was to investigate a thermal anomaly detected by orbital sensors, but as they sat in the windowless briefing rooms, surrounded by generals and men in dark suits, Sterling noticed that the maps they were given weren't drawn by NASA. They were ancient, hand-inked charts that looked like they belonged in a museum of the occult rather than a flight manual. "You are going where the light doesn't reach," a general had told them, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "And if you find what we think is there, you don't come back until the data is secure. Do you understand?" Sterling didn't answer. He just tightened his tie. He knew that in the world of high-stakes espionage, secure was often a code word for buried.
December 18th, 1974, 3:14 a.m. Pad 39A was bathed in the harsh, artificial glare of floodlights, but the usual army of technicians was absent. Only a skeleton crew of silent men in white coveralls remained. There were no news cameras, no crowds of tourists lining the beaches of Cocoa Beach. The Saturn V, a 363-foot tower of cold steel and volatile fuel, hissed in the night air, venting clouds of liquid oxygen that looked like ghostly fingers reaching for the stars. Inside the command module Odyssey, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of ozone and recycled air. Sterling and Lawson were bolted into their seats, their suits pressurized, their world reduced to the glowing dials of the control panel. "Flight, this is Apollo 18. Internal power confirmed. We are go for ignition," Sterling said into the comms. The voice that came back wasn't the usual cheerful Houston Capcom. It was cold, distant, and filtered through a heavy encryption layer. "Copy, 18. You are clear for the dark side protocol." When the 5 F1 engines ignited, the world ended for a moment. 7.5 million pounds of thrust turned the marshlands into a sea of fire. The vibration wasn't just sound, it was a physical assault that threatened to liquefy their bones. As the rocket cleared the tower, the sky over Florida turned from black to a bruised purple. Sterling watched the G-meter climb, 3, 4, 5 Gs. His vision narrowed to a pinprick. Behind them, the Earth was falling away, retreating into a haze of clouds and blue water. Ahead of them lay 3 days of silence, traveling through the void toward a destination that was increasingly looking like a one-way trip into the heart of a cosmic secret. The journey to the moon is often described as a majestic dance of physics,
But for Sterling and Lawson, it was a descent into paranoia. As they drifted further from Earth, the radio chatter became strange. They started picking up signals that shouldn't exist. Whispers in languages that sounded like Russian mixed with something ancient, something clicking and rhythmic. "Check the telemetry, Ben," Sterling ordered on the second day. "Houston Sears were on track, but the star tracker is locking on to coordinates that don't match the charts." Lawson was staring out the small, thick window. The Earth was now the size of a marble, beautiful and fragile. But on the dark side of the moon, which was now growing to fill their forward view, there were lights. Not the reflected light of the sun, but tiny pulsing points of blue and violet moving within the permanent shadows of the craters.
"Jack," Lawson whispered, his face pale in the reflected glow of the cabin lights. "The moon isn't a dead rock. It's broadcasting." He held out a headset. Sterling put it on. At first, there was only the hiss of cosmic background radiation, but then, underneath the static, he heard it, a heartbeat, slow, massive, and echoing as if it were coming from the very center of a hollow world. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a countdown that had been running for eons, and Apollo 18 was about to witness the 0 hour.
Descent into the maw. The descent into the Shackleton Crater was nothing like the simulations at the Nevada test site. As the lunar module Seeker began its braking burn over the Lunar South Pole, the onboard systems began to revolt. The Apollo guidance computer, usually a steady companion with its rhythmic clicking, suddenly flooded the display with 1201 and 1202 program alarms. But then the numbers shifted. The digital readouts began to cycle through characters that Sterling had never seen in any manual, strange, angular glyphs that looked more like ancient cuneiform than hexadecimal code. "Manual control, Ben! I'm taking her down!" Sterling shouted, his gloved hand gripping the joystick with white-knuckled intensity. Below them, in the absolute ink blackness of the crater floor, the lander's high-intensity floodlights cut through the void. They didn't hit the expected gray basalt or chaotic regolith. The surface below was smooth, polished like obsidian, and etched with a labyrinth of thin, glowing blue fractures. The Seeker landed with a heavy metallic resonance. The footpads didn't settle into dust, they struck something hollow, as if they had touched down on the lid of a gargantuan subterranean drum. When the engine cut, the silence in the cabin was physical. It wasn't the silence of an empty room, it was the predatory silence of a tomb that had been disturbed for the first time in eons. The process of depressurizing and egressing took what felt like an eternity. Every breath Sterling took echoed inside his fishbowl helmet like a gale-force wind. As he descended the ladder and stepped onto the obsidian floor, his boots made a sharp clack instead of a muffled thud. He panned his flashlight 45 degrees to the left, and his heart skipped a beat. 50 yards away, partially buried in lunar frost and micrometeorite erosion, stood a Soviet LK lander. Its spindly, spider-like legs and single-engine bell were unmistakable. On the side of the hull, beneath a layer of cosmic grime, the red star and the letters CCCP were still visible, gleaming faintly in the artificial light. "Houston, do you copy?" Sterling asked, his voice trembling. "We have a visual on a Soviet craft. It looks degraded, like it's been sitting here for 50 years. In response, there was only a rhythmic hissing, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement, underneath which he could hear a faint, multi-tonal whispering. The radio was dead. Lawson stepped toward the Soviet relic, his movements heavy in the 1/6 gravity. "Jack, look at the metal," Lawson whispered. The hull of the Russian ship wasn't just old, it was pitted and scarred as if it had endured centuries of exposure, far beyond what any 1970s alloy should survive. The hatch was ajar, hanging off its hinges, leading into an interior darkness that seemed thicker than the vacuum surrounding them.
The astronauts crossed the threshold. Their flashlights swept across a cramped cabin designed for a single cosmonaut. There was no body, but the signs of a recent, or perhaps ancient, presence were everywhere. Floating in the zero gravity of the deep pressurized cabin was an aluminum tube of Borst and a yellowed photograph of a woman and a child in front of a dacha in Saratov. Sterling turned the photo over. On the back, an inscription in Russian read, "Return to us, Alexei, 1974. But as Lawson shone his light closer, he noticed a terrifying detail. On the woman's wrist in the photo was a digital watch, an LED display glowing with a clarity and complexity that simply did not exist in 1974. It looked like a piece of technology from 50 years in the future. On the dashboard lay a flight log. When Sterling opened it, the pages weren't made of paper. They were a translucent, flexible material similar to mica. As he watched, the ink on the pages began to move. The Russian words for oxygen low bled into the English phrase, "They are watching us," which then dissolved into a cascading waterfall of binary code. Beneath the console, they found a reel-to-reel tape recorder. The reels were spinning slowly, despite the lack of any visible power source. Lawson patched the audio lead into his suit's comms, and his eyes widened behind his visor. "This isn't radio noise, Jack. It's a broadcast of us. I can hear my own heartbeat, but it's slowing down. It's a recording of my own death 3 hours from now." Suddenly, the entire hull of the Soviet craft began to vibrate. The sound was a low-frequency thrum that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly into their bones. Through the small triangular porthole of the LK, Sterling saw the obsidian crater floor begin to glow. The blue fractures beneath their feet widened, and a thick, luminous mist began to pour out, a physical impossibility in a vacuum. Within the mist, tall, slender silhouettes began to take shape. They were motionless, standing like sentinels on the edge of the light. "We have to go, now!" Sterling commanded, grabbing Lawson's shoulder. But Lawson was frozen, staring at the Soviet radar screen. The green CRT display was showing hundreds of blips surrounding their position. The blips weren't static. They were closing the circle with mathematical precision. And the most terrifying part? One of the blips was pulsing directly behind them, inside the cabin. Sterling turned slowly. In the corner of the module, shrouded in shadow, stood an empty Soviet Kretschit spacesuit. Its visor was retracted, revealing nothing but a swirling, misty void where a face should be. But from that void came a voice, a synthesized mechanical rasp that spoke in Sterling's own voice. "Welcome home, Jack. You're 50 years too late." The flight back to the Seeker was a panicked scramble. The moon's gravity felt heavier, as if the planet itself were trying to pull them down. Sterling felt time thickening around them, turning the airless void into a viscous fluid. Once they slammed the hatch of their own module shut and cycled the air, Lawson collapsed into his seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. On his glove was a residue from the Soviet hull, a fine silver dust that continued to pulse with that rhythmic heartbeat like blue light. "Jack, we didn't just find Russians," Lawson whispered, staring at his trembling hands. "We found a version of reality that was deleted. That ship is from a future that already happened, but we haven't reached yet. The moon isn't a satellite, it's a hard drive, and we just triggered a rewrite." Outside, something heavy struck the landing leg of the Seeker. Once, twice, a deliberate, demanding knock. Sterling looked at the comms array. A signal from Houston finally broke through the static, but the voice was cold and unfamiliar. It didn't belong to a flight controller. It sounded like a man speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "Leave Lawson. Save the world. The clock is ticking."
Inside the cramped cabin of the Seeker, the air began to change.
It didn't just smell of recycled oxygen and stale sweat anymore. It carried the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and something impossible, the scent of wet earth and Florida jasmine. Sterling checked the life support readings. Everything was nominal. No leaks, no CO2 spikes, but the smell was so vivid it made his head swim. This was the first stage of the temporal sickness, a psychological breakdown caused by the brain's inability to process the non-linear reality of the Shackleton Crater. "Do you hear that, Jack?" Lawson asked. He was slumped in the pilot's chair, his helmet off. His skin looked translucent under the harsh cabin lights, and his eyes were darting toward the corners of the ceiling. "It sounds like a playground. Kids laughing. I can hear the swings creaking." Sterling didn't hear the children, but he saw the shadows on the walls moving independently of the light sources. The shadow of the control stick began to elongate, crawling across the floor like a black snake, weaving through their legs. They were losing their grip on the now. On the moon, time is usually measured by the slow crawl of the sun across the horizon, but here, in the shadow of the monolith, time was a shattered mirror, reflecting 1,000 different moments at once.
Sterling looked out the small, triangular window of the lander. The obsidian floor of the crater was no longer empty. Standing just 20 feet away, near the shadow of a jagged rock, was a woman. She was wearing a light floral dress, her hair waving in a breeze that shouldn't exist in a vacuum. It was Mary, Sterling's wife. She looked exactly as she had on the day he left for the secret launch, holding a glass of iced tea, her eyes filled with a quiet, lingering dread. He knew it was a hallucination. He knew the physics of the moon would have turned her into a frozen statue in a fraction of a second. Yet she looked more real than the metallic interior of the ship. She waved at him, a slow, rhythmic motion that matched the heartbeat they had heard earlier. But as she waved, her image began to flicker like a damaged film strip. For a split second, her face would age 60 years, turning into a wrinkled, tear-streaked mask of an old woman before snapping back to the youthful face of 1974. "Jack," she mouthed, her voice echoing inside his skull without the aid of a radio. "Don't come home. If you come home, the fire starts."
"Jack, the watch! Look at the watch!" Lawson's voice was a panicked rasp. Sterling looked down at his Omega Speedmaster, the moon watch that was supposed to be the pinnacle of mechanical reliability. The second hand wasn't just spinning backward anymore, it was melting. The steel of the casing was softening, dripping onto his suit sleeve like liquid mercury, yet it felt ice-cold to the touch. Behind the melting crystal, the numbers on the dial were changing into years: 1974, 1986, 2001, 2025. The cabin's master alarm began to wail, a piercing, dissonant tone that sounded more like a human scream than an electronic warning. The radar altimeter showed they were ascending at 5,000 feet per second, while the external cameras showed they were still firmly planted on the crater floor. Reality was bifurcating. One part of the seeker was still in 1974, but another part of it was being pulled forward into a future that was struggling to manifest. Sterling reached for the radio to call Houston, but when he pressed the transmit button, the audio didn't go to Earth. Instead, he heard the sounds of a busy 21st century city, car horns, the hum of electricity, and the frantic voices of news anchors reporting on a global lunar displacement event.
"Look at the Earth, Jack. Just look at it," Lawson whispered, his voice devoid of all hope. Sterling turned his gaze to the blue marble hanging in the black sky above the crater rim. What he saw broke his mind. The Earth was split down the middle by a jagged, vertical line of static. The left side was the planet he knew, swirling white clouds, deep blue oceans, a vibrant world of life. But the right side was a scorched, blackened husk.
The continents were glowing with the dull red of cooling lava, and the atmosphere was a toxic gray shroud. The two Earths were grinding against each other, creating a ripple in the very fabric of space. Every time the ripple passed over the moon, the Seeker would vibrate so violently that Sterling felt his teeth might shatter. The monolith, it's a stabilizer, Lawson realized, his eyes wide with a sudden terrible clarity. It's a gravitational and temporal anchor. The Russians tried to move it. They tried to take a piece of it back to Moscow, and they broke the lock. That's why their ship is ancient. It's been trapped in the friction between these two timelines for 1,000 years.
The observers on the rim of the crater began to descend. They didn't walk, they drifted down the steep slopes like plumes of smoke. As they drew closer, Sterling could see through them. They were silhouettes of people, but their clothes were from different eras. Some in 1940s wool coats, others in sleek synthetic jumpsuits from a century yet to come. They were the temporal refugees, the souls of people whose timelines had been erased or rewritten by the instability of the lunar anchor. They gathered around the lander, their translucent hands pressing against the hull. The metal of the ship began to frost over where they touched it, forming patterns that looked like circuit boards. "They aren't here to hurt us," Lawson said, his voice now eerily calm, as if the sickness had finally claimed his sanity and replaced it with something else. "They're waiting for the choice. The anchor needs a conscious mind to reset the coordinates. It needs a ghost to stay in the machine." Sterling looked at his friend and saw the blue glow from the Soviet dust beginning to spread across Lawson's chest, forming a glowing web of light that pulsed in time with the moon's heavy, hidden heart. The 15-minute mark of their lives was approaching, and the price of a stable world was becoming clear.
The interior of the Seeker was no longer a sanctuary of American engineering. It had become a resonance chamber for 1,000 overlapping realities. The radio, which had been dead since they entered the crater's shadow, suddenly screamed into life. It wasn't the steady, professional tone of Capcom in Houston. The airwaves were a battlefield of overlapping signals, emergency broadcasts in German, frantic SOS calls in Mandarin, and the eerie rhythmic chanting of what sounded like a religious cult from a century yet to be born. Sterling slammed his hand against the radio dial, trying to find a clear frequency, but the tuner spun on its own, guided by a magnetic force that defied physics. Finally, the chaos settled into a single, ragged signal. The voice was heavy with a Russian accent, filtered through layers of digital corruption and half-century-old static. "Apollo 18, do you copy? This is Major Viktor Volkov of the International Lunar Station. We are broadcasting from the year 2025, or what remains of it." Lawson leaned forward, his face illuminated by the flickering green light of the signal strength meter. 2025? Jack, that's impossible. That's 50 years from now. The voice on the radio coughed, a dry, hacking sound that felt disturbingly close. "Time is a luxury you no longer have, Commander Sterling. We are looking at you through the historical archives, and we are looking at you through the telescope of the Great Collapse. You are at the anchor. The obsidian pillar you see, it is not a monument, it is a stabilizer. In our timeline, the Soviet expedition of '74 tried to extract the core of the pillar. They wanted the power of time. They failed, and in their failure, they cracked the foundation of the world."
Volkov's voice began to fade, replaced by the sound of sirens and the distant roar of an ocean that sounded like it was swallowing a city. "Listen carefully," the voice returned, now more desperate. "The moon is not a natural satellite. It was placed here as a corrective lens for Earth's reality. It keeps the now from bleeding into the then. But the crack is spreading. In our 2025, the sky has turned black during the day. The tides have stopped. People are simply vanishing.
forgotten by history because their birth dates have been overwritten by the glitch. We call it the Great Erasure. You are the only ones left at the point of origin. You are standing at the very moment the timeline splits. Sterling felt a cold sweat prickling his skin inside his suit. He looked at the monolith outside. It didn't look like a machine. It looked like a tear in the universe. "What do we do?" Sterling shouted into the mic. "How do we fix it?" Volkov's reply was chillingly clinical. "The pillar requires an observer. Quantum physics dictates that reality only solidifies when it is witnessed. To reset the anchor, a conscious human mind must remain within the field of the monolith. You must serve as a biological processor, holding the year 1974 in your mind with such intensity that the universe has no choice but to make it real. If you both leave, the moon will drift, and the 21st century will collapse into a sea of white noise. One of you must stay."
As Volkov spoke, the monolith began to pulse with a blinding white light. The walls of the Seeker seemed to dissolve, turning transparent. Sterling and Lawson weren't just in a lander anymore. They were standing in the middle of a vast, infinite library of light. They saw the faces of every person who would ever live, and every person who had been erased. They saw the rise and fall of empires that had never existed in their history books. They saw a 1980s where Washington, D.C. was a forest, and a 2010s where humans lived in cities under the Martian crust. "It's too much," Lawson groaned, clutching his head. "I can see all of it, Jack. I can see the moment I was born and the moment I'm supposed to die. It's all happening at once." The blue dust on Lawson's suit began to glow with a fierce violet intensity. It was no longer just dust, it was a living circuit connecting Lawson's nervous system to the lunar core. The observers on the crater rim were now moving closer, their translucent faces filled with a strange, mournful hope. They were the ghosts of the failed timelines, the billions of souls who were waiting for someone to give them a home, or to finally let them rest in the silence of a stable history.
The radio signal from 2025 began to break apart into digital screams. "Sterling! Lawson! You have 5 minutes until the lunar window closes. If the ascent engine doesn't fire now, the gravity of the monolith will trap you forever. Decide, who is the anchor? Who stays to watch the world?" Sterling looked at his controls. The abort stage button was glowing amber. He could hit it now and they could both try to flee. But he looked back at the Earth, the fractured, flickering marble in the sky. He saw the red veins of the dying future creeping across the Atlantic. He thought of Mary. He thought of the iced tea and the jasmine. If he went back, would she even be there? Or would he return to a world of static and ash? Lawson stood up. His movements were no longer shaky. The sickness seemed to have passed, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline calm. He looked at Sterling, and for the first time, his eyes weren't filled with fear. They were filled with the light of the monolith. "I've always been good with numbers, Jack," Lawson said softly. "I can hold the coordinates. I can keep 1974 alive. I can be the one who watches." "No, Ben, we can both get out. We'll find another way," Sterling argued, but his voice lacked conviction. He felt the crushing weight of the responsibility. They weren't just astronauts anymore. They were the architects of time.
The cabin of the Seeker began to groan as the gravitational tides of the crater intensified. Pieces of equipment began to float, then accelerate, caught in a localized vortex. The voice of Volkov made one last garbled appearance. "Thank you, Apollo 18. We see the light. The sky is turning blue again. The tides, they're coming back." The signal cut into a pure, clean hiss. The 2025 that had been screaming for help was gone, replaced by a silence that felt like a new beginning. Sterling reached for Lawson's hand, but Lawson stepped back, moving toward the open hatch. "Go home, Commander. Tell them we found a wasteland. Tell them there's nothing here but rocks and dust. If they knew what this place really was, they'd never stop trying to weaponize it. They'd break the world all over again." Lawson didn't wait for a reply. He jumped from the ladder, floating down to the obsidian floor. He walked toward the monolith and sat at its base, his back against the cold, black stone. In the darkness of the crater, he looked like a small, lonely spark of light against the infinite black. The choice was made. The 15-minute countdown to the end of their partnership and the beginning of the world's survival had reached its final seconds.
The cabin of the Seeker was a graveyard of shared memories. Jack Sterling sat in the commander's seat, his hand hovering over the ascent engine arming switch. Through the triangular window, he could see Ben Lawson. His friend sat motionless against the obsidian base of the monolith, the blue light of the lunar core now flowing through him like glowing veins. Lawson didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like a statue dedicated to the end of time. "Ben, do you read me?" Sterling's voice cracked. There was no verbal reply, only a steady, rhythmic pulse of static on the comms. Thump, 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 thump. Lawson's heartbeat had become the radio signal. It was the only thing holding the reality of 1974 together. If Sterling stayed a second longer, the gravitational shear of the stabilizing timeline would tear the lunar module apart. With a trembling hand, Jack flipped the protective cover and pressed the ignition. The ascent stage erupted in a silent burst of hypergolic flame. Sterling was slammed into his seat as the top half of the lander separated from its base, leaving Ben Lawson, the Soviet LK, and the secrets of the Shackleton Crater behind. As Sterling rose, the view of the crater floor began to shrink. The massive black monolith, which had seemed like a god just moments ago, became a tiny speck in a sea of lunar shadows. He watched the single spark of Lawson's helmet light until it was swallowed by the curvature of the moon. As he broke into the sunlight of lunar orbit, the sickness began to fade, but it was replaced by a hollow, aching void. The command module Odyssey was waiting for him, piloted by the automated systems, or perhaps by the observers who had finally found their peace. As Sterling docked and crawled into the larger spacecraft, he felt like a ghost entering a museum. Everything was too clean, too normal. The smell of stale coffee and tang was a cruel joke compared to the jasmine and ozone of the crater. He looked at the Earth. It was no longer flickering. The red veins of the dead 2025 were gone, replaced by the serene, swirling white and blue of a healthy world. The anchor had held. The world was safe, but the price was a man who would never have a grave. The splashdown in the Pacific was a somber affair. There were no recovery ships on the horizon, no Navy frogmen waiting to hoist the capsule. Only a single, unmarked black vessel approached the Odyssey. When the hatch opened, Sterling wasn't met by doctors, but by the men in dark suits from the oversight. They didn't ask if he was okay. They only asked for the film canisters and the data logs. "Where is Lawson?" the lead agent asked, his eyes hidden behind dark aviators. "He didn't make it. Equipment failure," Sterling lied, his voice as cold as the lunar vacuum. He saw the agent look at him with a glimmer of suspicion, but they didn't push. They knew the Shackleton Crater took what it wanted. Sterling was debriefed in a windowless room for 3 weeks. They stripped him of his rank, gave him a new identity, and a pension that was more like hush money. He was told that Apollo 18 was a ghost mission, that if he ever spoke of the monolith, or the Soviet ship, or the man who stayed behind, he would simply cease to exist. The decades crawled by. The 1970s bled into the neon 80s, the digital 90s, and the frantic world of the new millennium. Jack Sterling lived a quiet life in a small house on the Florida coast, not far from the rusted skeletons of the old launch pads. To his neighbors, he was just a grumpy old man who spent too much time on his porch with a vintage brass telescope. But Sterling wasn't watching the stars, he was watching the South Pole of the moon. Every night, when the atmospheric distortion was low, he would aim his lens at the Shackleton Crater. He knew the physics said it was impossible to see a single man from that distance, yet every December 18th, on the anniversary of the launch, he would see it. A tiny, microscopic flicker of blue light in the deepest part of the shadow, a heartbeat made of photons. Then Lawson was still there. Because time didn't exist in the shadow of the monolith, Lawson was still sitting there in 1974, his oxygen frozen at 10%, his mind holding the world together for 1 billion people who would never know his name.
Now it is December 2025, the date Major Volkov had called from. The world is different, but it is alive. There are no black skies, no vanishing cities. Jack Sterling is 90 years old, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He sits in his wheelchair on the porch, the salt air stinging his eyes. He looks through the telescope one last time. The moon is full and bright, a beautiful and different rock, but as Sterling stares into the eyepiece, the image begins to ripple. The static returns to his hearing aid, a familiar, rhythmic thump-thump. The blue light in the crater suddenly flares, brighter than he has ever seen it. And then a voice, clear, young, and vibrant, speaks directly into his mind. You can let go now, Jack. The shift is complete. The timeline is locked. Sterling smiles, a single tear carving a path through his wrinkled cheek. He sees the observers standing on his lawn, their translucent forms finally solidifying into the light of the setting sun. He closes his eyes, feeling the jasmine scent of the moon one last time. The anchor has been pulled up. The mission of Apollo 18 is finally over. And somewhere, in a crater where the sun never shines, 2 empty suits stand side by side, watching the Earth turn.